Hello and welcome to the second in our Heart One series of podcasts. This podcast will talk about the pericardial sac, also known as the pericardium. So peri just means around, cardium means heart. So the pericardial sac or the pericardium surrounds the heart. And if you look at the cartoon, you can see in that upper row cartoon of the heart, and then right below the heart would be something like a fluid-filled balloon. And then if you take the heart and you push it into that fluid-filled balloon, you can see that the balloon takes a shape around the heart, and the innermost layer of the balloon would correspond to the inner layer of the sac that surrounds the heart, and then the outer layer of the balloon would correspond to the outer layer of the sac that surrounds the heart. And then the blue stuff in between the fluid would correspond to the fluid in the sac that surrounds the heart. So you can imagine the heart is beating. It can beat stronger or less strong depending if you're exercising or not, but you want a nice fluid-filled sac around the heart so that it can soak up the pressure changes that the heart does when it's beating. So it says here that the heart is a double-walled sac. There's an inner wall and an outer wall, and it covers the heart and the great vessels. And if you saw the last podcast on blood vessels in the heart, you'd know that the great vessels were those major vessels coming out of the heart and going into the heart. So the major great vessel going out of the heart is the aorta, and the and the other major great vessel that's going out of the heart is the pulmonary trunk. And then the major great vessels that are going into the heart are the inferior and superior vena cava. So if you look at the cartoon at the bottom of this slide, you can see a cartoon of the heart. You can see the aorta, which is the tube coming out of the heart. It's got those three little tubes poking out of it. And then you can also see the pulmonary trunk. And the pulmonary trunk is coming out of the right side of the heart. And if you remember in the last podcast, I said that in these diagrams you have to think opposite right and left. So as you look at the cartoon, the right side of the heart is actually your left side, and the left side of the heart is actually your right side. So if you look at the pulmonary trunk coming out of the right part of the heart, you can see that they do a little cut. They put a little square around that area between the pulmonary trunk, which is a great vessel, and the wall of the heart, or the sac of the heart, and then they enlarge that diagram. And then if you come over and look at the enlarged part of the diagram at the bottom of the screen, you can let's look at start at the deepest layer. So there's the heart wall and the heart chamber. So at the very bottom of that cartoon is the heart chamber, and that heart chamber would be the left atrium. And then if you go superficial to the heart chamber, you can see that the heart chamber is lined by endocardium. Endocardium is made up of endothelial cells, and if you saw the last podcast, endothelial cells also line blood vessels. And then superficial to the endocardium is the myocardium. So myo means muscle. That's where all the heart muscle cells live. And then superficial to the myocardium and still part of the heart wall is a layer called the epicardium. And then, so epi just means on top of, so epi on top of the heart. And then in parentheses it says the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. So histologically, this is a serous membrane, and it secretes serous fluid, which is different than mucus. It's a little more slippery and less viscous. Serous fluid is. So if you remember from 201, there's a visceral and a parietal motif. So the visceral part of any organ is the part of the serous membrane that's on top of the organ, and then the parietal layer is the part that lines the wall or the cavity that the organ is in. So if you find the epicardium and you trace it towards the pulmonary trunk, you see that it folds back on itself, and where it folds back on itself right off the pulmonary trunk, that's when you start calling it the parietal layer of the serous pericardium. So when it's on top of the heart, it's the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, aka the epicardium. When it folds back on itself, then it's called the parietal layer of the serous pericardium. So both the visceral and parietal layers of the serous pericardium, it's a serous membrane. It's secreting serous fluid into that pericardial cavity, and that's where the serous fluid lives. So in the balloon diagram, where you saw the fluid-filled balloon, the fluid part after you set the heart down into the balloon, that would be analogous to the serous fluid. And then you can also see on top of the parietal layer of the serous pericardium is a fibrous pericardium. So actually the pericardium has two layers: of fibrous pericardium made up of connective tissue fibers, mostly collagen, to make the sac tough, and then deep to the fibrous pericardium is the serous pericardium. And then right on top of the heart is the epicardium. So this is just another cartoon of the pericardial sac, and you can see they take the little inset, or that square part, out of the heart, not up by the pulmonary trunk, but rather more, they take out the square a little bit lower in the heart, but it's still got the same layer. So you can see that there's a parietal pericardium, so find the parietal pericardium, and you see that the parietal pericardium has two layers, the fibrous and the serous layer. And then there is the epicardium, and the epicardium has a visceral component to it. And remember, the visceral and parietal pericardium together are just a continuation of a serous membrane that secretes serous fluid. So, and then here I tell you that the parietal pericardium histologically is two parts. I told you that it has an outer wall that's connective tissue, and then the inner parietal layer is a serous membrane. So histologically, the parietal layer of the pericardium is a serous membrane. And then the epicardium, or that part that sits on top of the heart, is also called the visceral pericardium. And that visceral pericardium, aka the epicardium, is histologically, it's a simple squamous epithelial membrane. And that's the type of cell that lives in the serous membrane. So it's simple, so that means it's one layer. Squamous, that's the shape of the cell. But because it's secreting serous fluid, it's also called a serous membrane. So the serous fluid that lives between the visceral and parietal layers decreases friction during heartbeats. If you get an inflammation of that, the pericardia, the visceral and parietal layers, then will get rough and they'll rub against each other, and that causes inflammation and pain. If you get excess fluid that builds up in that pericardial sac, it can compress the heart, makes the heart harder. It's harder for the heart to beat when there's fluid in the sac. It's pushing down on the heart. That's called cardiac tamponade. And usually you have to go in with a syringe to drain the fluid in the pericardial cavity. So you can see in this cartoon where the pericardial cavity is, they'd have to go in with a large needle and take the fluid out. But you can see if the fluid builds up in that pericardial cavity, you can see how it would compress the heart. And I think that's it.